Hi, my name is Kelly Carson, and I'm here on Face to Face with Marion Cumming. We're here to discuss the current deer issue in the CRD. So where do we go from here, Marion?
Well, I'm coming from a perspective of having considered deer an interesting nuisance, and partly through having increasing numbers of deer in my garden and having a wonderful housemate, Shoko Inouye, I've learned to really appreciate them and see them as a blessing in the garden, even though I'm aware that there are neighbors all around me who might not agree.
So have you found that your neighbors have been up in arms about these deer?
No close neighbors that I'm aware of, but certainly there are even friends who feel quite differently on the issue. And I think gradually, as they and the general public become aware of the choices and how cruel a cull is as it's put forward by the CRD, then we'll realize that there's a humane alternative that we can settle for and still decrease the numbers of deer.
We know there are humane options to deal with this perceived overpopulation of deer, which, by the way, hasn't been proven. There's never been a deer count. No one's proven that there is an overpopulation or that these animals are simply driven out of their natural habitat by all the development that's been going on. But the real process against the deer began when the CRD asked for input into deer experiences, didn't it? And they received 400 letters, basically of complaints to the CRD about the deer.
Well, yes, and I think by their soliciting complaints, it meant from the very beginning there wasn't the balance. It can be understood that people tend to be biased on an issue like this, and that's fine, but then the Citizens Advisory Group should have been more balanced with biases on both sides, and instead it was just very pro-cull.
Well, when they appointed the Citizens Advisory Group, they had actually, I've got it written here, what the criteria was to appoint the CAG. And one of the criteria was that they be neither pro or anti-deer and without consideration of any group affiliation. So they went ahead and they appointed the representative for the United Bow Hunters Association. So there was a very biased individual that was appointed. Two others were the farmers, the Central Saanich farmers, who had already been in the media demanding a cull of deer.
Well, yes, and you'd be familiar with Madrona Farm, where David Chambers actually made an application to be part of the Citizens Advisory Group and was turned down. And that would have been a very good example of balance, because I think it was 13 acres that he fenced in, and he provides forage for the deer near a source of water, so the deer are not tempted to go where they're not wanted.
That's right. He manages what he calls a herd of deer out there, and they have no issues with them because they use the fencing, the lure crops, and the deer are given a place to live. So, but no, you're right. He didn't end up on the Citizens Advisory Group. It was the ones that were already rattling their sabers for a cull. So the other members of the group may have been unbiased. Most of them seemed to be, but as the process continued, it was 14 meetings over 4 months. And
I'd forgotten how many.
As the process continued, you could see more and more of a cull bias in the individuals, except for two who were becoming extremely frustrated when they asked for more current research. because the CRD, the deer issue, is going to be handled in different ways. There's the urban deer, the rural deer, the agricultural deer, and they're going to have to be handled in different ways. So they really wanted more current research for the urban deer on spayback, and the CAG staff or the CRD staff would just say, we're working with what we have. In other words, they're working with the BC Ungulate report written by Gail Hesse. There was no further study, no further research done, even though it was asked for by these members of the CAG. They became so frustrated, they resigned about halfway through the process.
Yes, I recall that occurring, and then it was predictable that the final report would be remarkably similar to one that came out just a short, 2 or 5 years before? Because they had virtually the same consultants and experts. And it seemed to me it was a expenditure of about $40,000 of taxpayers' money.
Well, the Culling, it was a terribly biased committee, and their recommendations were very predictable because anyone who had read the Gail Hesse's report would have seen that it was pro-cull. And so every committee in the province that uses her report basically has the same old research. Their results are going to be predictable. What we need to see are deer committees that are empowered to research in their own areas what's going to work for them. The CRD has taken this leadership role, and they're taking the CAG report out and the recommendations to our municipalities. But it really is a cookie-cutter solution, which is the very thing they knew they couldn't do.
Well, I'm thankful that there are a few items on the 10-point agenda that the CRD is presenting to the 13 municipalities. And the one is we agree with them pretty much on fencing, although we'd put more of an emphasis on wildlife corridors than has occurred with the CRD, incorporating corridors rather than fencing out deer to the point where there's nowhere to go except possibly into traffic. Another point of agreement is basically the more up-to-date signage along roads and highways, and also in areas where there are deer crossings to make sure that speed limits are appropriate and also enforced.
There are so many other ways to handle the so-called deer issue. Now, one thing we also need to bring up is the reasons for the cull, not simply the letters that came out that were sent to the CRD, but the reasons that people want the deer dead are absolutely mystifying. They're claiming that one day a child is going to be killed, and that these animals are aggressive, and they're on the roads. One day someone's going to be killed in a car. All their claims have yet to happen, and I've been in this province all my life. I haven't heard any of this before, but I was very, very pleased to hear Sarah Dubois when she was interviewed recently. She made a very good point. She said that raccoons and dogs and cats are hit by cars regularly, and no one's looking to cull them. So,
and the comment has been made that more dogs kill people, and yet we're not about to cull the dog.
So it's mystifying why this particular species is being targeted in this way.
There is a fear for children, and one of the Oak Bay councillors at a meeting we attended that commented that a deer could kill a child. And I thought it was so heartening that a number of parents and others called for an outpouring of love for the deer. They didn't call it a demonstration, but in effect there was a manifestation in front of the Oak Bay Municipal Hall. And parents with numerous little children were there, and the children were just very candid about how they love the deer and they're not afraid of the deer. I think we need to be quite sensible, but we don't need to be fearful. And all over the world, there's an increasing migration of wildlife into cities because we're becoming overpopulated with people as a planet. And I like that expression, urbanized deer or urbanized wildlife, because we people have taken millions of years to become urbanized. So why can we not understand that that happens with wildlife as well?
Well, it seems that the deer are actually evolving rather quickly.
Yes.
Yeah. On the subject of children, I think we also need to be sensitive to how this is going to affect them. Children are very aware that something sinister is happening with our deer. They may not listen to the news, but I've been doing outreach for more than a year now, and when I'm out there talking to parents, children are very aware of what's being discussed. I remember one little girl started tugging on her mother's dress, and she was saying, "Don't talk to her, Mom." And I was kind of mystified by that, and her mother knew exactly what was going on, and she looked at her little girl and said, "It's okay, honey, she wants to save the deer." So I wonder what children are hearing. You can certainly see what they're feeling. Like that little girl just wanted to go away when she thought I was going to hurt the deer. So this is definitely impacting children, and we need to be sensitive to that as well. We can't brush this aside. This is a serious psychological issue.
Speaking of brushing aside, it's interesting that the CRD has used the term the capture and euthanize, which is a way of taking a soft brush and just hiding or attempting to conceal what actually goes on in the form of cruelty to animals. That shot bolt gun, as the U.S. Humane Society has pointed out, should never be used on wildlife. It was designed to be used under the controlled conditions of
Well, it's called a captive bolt gun for a reason. It's meant to be used on captive bovines. At this point, I would like to mention that we have a pamphlet that is also available on our website at www.DeerSafeVictoria.com. And on the website, you'll see that we're explaining what the clover trap bolt gun actually is, and you can see the pictures on the website. But what the public is unaware of is that this is not a humane method to kill the animals. And the public is under the impression, because of the language that the CRD and other communities are using, capture and euthanize, is the good death. But what this clover trap bolt gun killing is a horrific way for these animals to die. I mean, these are wild animals. They're caught in a netted trap. They're in it all night. They in the morning, these men come, drop the net down on them, sit on them, and bolt gun them with a captive bolt gun, which is not intended for use on these types of animals or in this type of condition. So we know very well that the contractors will say this is humane, but we know very well it isn't. And we had a witness in Cranbrook in the February 2013 call who witnessed the deer in the trap. She was terrified. What drew him to the trap was the sound she was making. And he stood and waited for the contractor to show up. It was about an hour later. The contractor came along, saw him, had harsh words with him, they had an altercation that actually made the local papers.
Oh, really?
Yes, so the contractor left. He came back 45 minutes later, I think hoping that the witness had left, but the witness hadn't left. And he watched this doe bolt gunned. She was taken out of the net and she was still kicking while she was being dragged to the truck. Anyone who goes to witness this method of killing may well come back and say it was professionally done, or we see it as humane. But out of 24 deer that were killed in Cranbrook this February, how many were humanely done, if it's possible? It just doesn't seem possible.
And I think you mentioned in the culls there are a number of fawns and deer that are not being bothersome in any way. And in one situation, there was a problem buck, and he never was captured.
In Cranbrook, yeah.
So, in Cranbrook.
The traps are indiscriminate, and apparently so are the contractors, because in Cranbrook or Kimberley, I think it was mostly Cranbrook, they were the first to cull. It was found that they were targeting the what they call mule deer out there. We have black-tailed deer, but they were also trapping and killing white-tailed deer, which aren't the problem, and fawns and pregnant does. So this is just indiscriminate slaughter, and there's no way that this can ever be humane.
I thought it was interesting that a butcher was engaged to participate in one of the culls, and he subsequently called it barbaric. And I thought, for someone who's accustomed to killing animals in a slaughterhouse, it must be very revealing that he would consider this intolerable.
One thing we are doing as DeerSafe is we're letting the CRD know that there's opposition to the deer cull. So we've been collecting signatures for, I guess we started last summer, and we've already given the CRD 1,631 signatures that are resident signatures, and this summer we've already collected well over 1,000, and we'll be presenting them to the planning committee very soon. So
I'm thankful that the petition includes a focus on humane alternatives, and one of them is Spayvac, which, as an amateur, I'm not qualified to speak about except to give my support from what I've learned. And I think it's just so encouraging to realize that if there is an acknowledgement that the deer have been growing in numbers in many of our urban areas. I've certainly seen it in my own neighborhood and garden. This Spayvac, an immunocontraceptive, is a way of ensuring that any doe that is injected with Spayvac the following spring will not bear fawns. And not only that, but it's meant to be effective for what is likely the rest of its life in an urban context, 5 or 6 years normally.
That's right. And even though the clover traps need to be used for the Spayvac program, the deer don't spend near the time in those traps. They're monitored. If a buck goes in, he's released. From my understanding is that it's a shot that they get an inoculation, and they're tagged and colored. And from my understanding, it takes 5 to 10 minutes. So she's released as soon as possible. So there's, it's not as stressful as being in a trap all night waiting for a bolt gun. So also, it's a far more humane option to reduce deer populations, if that is the goal, because, as you said, she won't have fawns that fall, or that spring, so you'll see an immediate reduction in deer, And the good thing about keeping the population and slowly diminishing it through attrition is that the deer that are occupying that space will keep out new deer from coming in, whereas when you cull, you remove a large population of animals, and that just opens it up for others to move in, and also the surviving females start to procreate at a younger age. So that hole is actually filled very quickly. And what they found in Kimberley, where they actually killed 99 deer that winter before last, within 3 months their deer population had increased. So it's definitely not a solution. Helena, Montana, where this clover trap technology came from, cull annually. So when you consider that the last cull in Cranbrook was $625 per year, if they want to keep doing that every year, that's a lot of money to the taxpayers annually, whereas SPAVAC is implemented. It might be a little more per deer, but it doesn't need to be done time and time again.
Well, yes, I understand if you carry it through the years, then it actually could pan out to be a lower cost?
Absolutely, because you're not doing this, the expensive part will be the clover trapping, the inoculating, and you're not doing it annually because this inoculation the antibody stays in the doe's body for years.
Well, where SPAVAC in Canada is considered still an experimental project, it's ironic that it was developed at Dalhousie University over 20 years ago and is more acceptable in the U.S. than in Canada. But one advantage of calling it an experimental project is that I think in Oak Bay, if it can be applied, we could be a model for the world. The deer could be collared, and that way the does could be tracked over the years, assuming the batteries are kept live or however the collars work. And it would be very interesting to be able to track the deer behavior and movement.
Well, there's that, and then we'd finally have that deer count that needs to be done.
Exactly, yes.
Yeah. So we have a website. We're at www.DeerSafeVictoria.com.
Oh, and Kelly, you were mentioning how in Kimberley, after the failure of their culling 99 deer, and 3 months later, as you say, the population was shown to have grown, that then they decided that they would take a humane route on an experimental basis?
Yeah, clearly the culling wasn't going to work in Kimberley or any community. I guess they have to find out for themselves. But Kimberley decided that they wanted to try hazing, which is using herding dogs in controlled situations. The BC government flat out said no, that hazing was not a possibility, that they banned it. They said it hadn't been tested, which is absolute nonsense because the federal government uses it in Waterton National Park in Alberta, and it's used successfully there every year. So they turned Kimberley down twice for a hazing permit and allowed them to have a trial permit in May. The hazing trial went very well. There were municipal councillors, committee people, and a cinematographer out there filming it. And apparently it went flawlessly because these dogs know what they're doing. They're not frightening the deer, they're suggesting.
And my understanding is that it needs to be continued over time because otherwise the deer will migrate back.
Of course, you can't just do it once. No, the deer will keep coming back, and you just bring the dogs back out and send them on their way until they realize that that's not a comfortable place to be. I'm not sure. I don't know that much about hazing or how long it takes, but I know they do it annually in Waterton, but they're also hazing elk and other species. So it's a different situation out there. But it will work in Kimberley. They again have a different situation than we have on the island. But there are so many alternatives that are humane that we don't need to be culling.
Yes, speaking of humane, I was fascinated. I have some neighbors about a block away who discovered something very simple. They're keen gardeners with a beautiful garden, and the deer had been leaping over into their garden and munching away, and the wife particularly was furious. And I think for 3 years now, they've been using what's called lay-down fencing. We're familiar with how cattle will avoid walking on certain surfaces, but I hadn't known that about deer until I saw these panels of simple lay-down fencing. They're just laid down on the grass boulevard outside these rose bushes that form a main part of the sort of low hedge along the front of their garden. And even though the panels only measure about 2 feet by 8 feet and are invisible when they're laid down in the grass, and they can be lifted up for mowing the grass, the deer will just, they'll be there with their noses about 1 meter away from, or even 2 feet away, I guess, from these overhanging rose bushes, and will not disturb them. Just because
they will
not leap over this low hedge into the garden. And there are a number of solutions, and one I heard from friends who were visiting from Germany recently, and they decided that they didn't see any deer on their short visit. They were hoping they would, but my friend Dr. Wagner, when he went back to Germany, contacted a hunter friend whom he asked about what is done about keeping deer out of certain areas in Germany. And this friend mentioned how they use recordings of wolves and coyotes, and I think even sounds of bears, and that keeps the deer out of certain areas where they're not wanted. And I hadn't heard of that being done in BC, although there certainly are other forms of persuading deer to go elsewhere from, I guess you hear of noises, but they're more intrusive. Some people will hang discs on a tree and the deer don't like the reflections. Or
deer whistles on cars. That's another one for highways. They're very little. They're just little units that you slip on the grill, and as you're traveling, the air goes through them, and only deer can hear them. Deer and dogs, I would think.
And then I have a number of friends who are growing more and more native plants in their gardens, and on a garden tour, I managed to snap some photographs. And I find in my own garden as well, where I'm increasing the native species, that the deer tend to prune the native plants without killing them. And there are even species of rose, like the heritage rose, the rugosa rose, I think it's called, can be planted, that tends to be deer resistant, as opposed to some of the other roses that the deer are very keen on. And Kelly, you mentioned when you came back from this recent trip to the interior that there were even petunias growing in an area where the deer are just passing them by.
Yep, that's in Invermere, right downtown Invermere, and they're surrounded by forest. I saw several deer when I was there, but right in the downtown core are these enormous planters of beautiful petunias, and they're unmolested.
Well,
so
I found Bobex was introduced to me by a friend with a big native plant garden in her front garden, and she didn't want to put up an ugly fence. In fact, it would have been illegal. So she uses this deer repellent called Bobex that's actually locally manufactured here in Victoria. And maybe that's what was keeping the deer from the petunias.
No, they weren't actually using it, but I think it spoke to me about the exaggeration of a deer problem, because I did see plenty of deer while I was there, but certainly not in town eating the petunias.
Well,
yeah, probably just enough population that they aren't coming into town, but a human population to drive them away. Another thing I saw while I was on my trip last week is wildlife overpasses on the BC-Alberta highway. There's probably 4 or 5 of those. They also have underpasses for wildlife. And all along the highway, in fact, one stretch, a couple miles I was traveling on, workers were out installing more fencing. So the highways are fenced, and the deer are given, the cougars, all of them, the bears, the wolves, they're given an area to cross safely. So the fencing keeps them off the highway, and they're kind of funneled to these actually, they're really beautiful architectural feats, these overpasses.
And I think the plantings along roads and highways are being given closer examination now, like just as farmers will plant lure crops to keep the deer under control, that along highways, if you don't have fencing, you want to make sure that you don't have plantings that are going to attract the wildlife that can then collide with vehicles.
Yeah, we just need to look to other places. BC is very behind on this, but the deer issue is also very new to BC. You know, as I said, I've lived here all my life. I've never heard complaints about deer, much less the call to kill them. But we need to look to we need to look to Alberta, to how they're handling their ungulate population, and other countries, as you say. You know how they handle
I think
it in Germany.
If people realize that deer on the island here have plummeted, that in 1968 the BC government estimated about 300,000 native deer, the black-tailed deer on the island, and now it's a high of 65,000 and a low of 45,000. That's a huge spread for an estimate, but it's just a fraction of the population that used to thrive on the island.
That's why we call it a guesstimate.
Yes.
Yeah, because the fact is there's never been a deer count, ever, so it's, that's another thing that they've never made clear and never discussed at the CAG or anyone, is how many deer is going to be enough to kill. How many is going to make a difference? I think they're guessing. Right now, Oak Bay and Central Saanich have agreed to a so-called pilot project where they're going to kill 20 deer. Now, they're not, the media hasn't been clear if it's 20 in each community or 10 in each. But to me, that's a completely useless exercise, because if it's simply out of curiosity, all they have to do is pick up the phone and ask Kimberly how their cull went. If they want to know if it was humane, talk to the contractors from Kimberly and from Cranbrook and ask them how it went, because they don't need to see it with their own eyes. It's been done. This is nothing new now in the province, so there's no need for that.
Yes. And it's rather ironic that just by coincidence, when I met with Mayor Niels Jensen of Oak Bay, I mentioned if 12 does were given Spayvac, the immunocontraceptive, that it's hard to pin a figure on how many fawns would not be born the following spring, but it could possibly be about 20 fawns, which would be a humane way of reducing the population by 20, rather than deciding outright to have a cruel cull of 20 deer. It might be worthwhile to mention how the expression that deer are being currently culled by car that has been often repeated. And a friend made the comment that if a human being were told, well, chances are that during their lifetime they'd be involved in a car accident, so I can just kill you now, that we would say, I'll take my chances. And by the same token, it's just so merciless to think of killing deer that might or might not be killed by cars.
Well, we're hearing a lot of that, killing them for their own good, aren't we? They're getting caught on fences, they're being hit by cars. It's absolutely mystifying, and there's no other animal in British Columbia that's being considered this way.
I think it's so gratifying to realize that experts on both sides of the divide of the controversy are pretty much agreed that Lyme disease is not a threat in BC. It's just been blown out of proportion because of fears. And the deer can have the Lyme ticks, but it's just statistically very, very rare, and it's been rodents that carry them, and even pets that go into people's homes, and even songbirds. So I think that that particular concern is not, the deer just are not a threat. So we'll hope that the fears on the part of the public are being allayed now that the information is getting out there.
Health Canada has no concerns about Lyme disease, so it's another one of those things, the fear mongering that's going on around these animals. So,
and you'd shown me, I think it was a public survey that was undertaken, and people cared more about property damage, whether it was farms or gardens, than they did about the health and safety report.
This was all the letters that had been written into the CAG, the responses, and they put it on a graph. Thank you for reminding me of that, because actually Mayor Jensen has been out there saying that it's health and safety that really is the issue here, when in fact it's not. The CRD's own figures have shown that 50.9% of the problem that people have with the deer is property damage. Health risk to 12.1%, road safety 14.7%, deer aggression 10.8%. So clearly the biggest issue really is property damage, and most of those will be gardens. I've read most of those 400 letters, and that's the issue. So it's not about health or safety.
Yes, and that fear of the deer seems to be a major component of fear of aggression, and at times it's natural that does will protect their fawns, and that we should be practical during rutting season, where the males can actually lock horns occasionally when they're after
we
a doe.
Definitely need a public education program around the deer. People are unaware of their own body language. They don't know the deer body language. It's just we need a strong public education around the ungulate behavior.
And you were mentioning concerns about dogs too that might threaten the doe who's trying to protect her fawns. So as
there have been some people also need to understand they need to keep their dog on a leash where deer are known to live. Deer have also been subjected to some pretty awful things by people with dogs who a friend of ours recently saw someone slip their dog off the leash and sick it on a doe. So people are getting their dogs to chase them. So it's an unhealthy situation. People might want to help with our efforts. We have our website, and we have a petition that's on the website in a PDF form, so it can be printed off. And we are getting quite a few people printing it off and mailing it in to us. There's an address at the bottom. We very much appreciate the signatures. Anyone who wants to contact us can do so through the website. We have the Contact Us.
And is there a way that people beyond the CRD can sign the petition?
We do have a visitor petition, but it's not printable. We tend to get those signatures when we're out doing outreach and visitors hear what's going on. And we've had signatures from all over the world. But no, not from the website. We don't have anything for that.
Well, people could start a petition of their own, for that matter.
They could, but in order to add to the numbers that we're collecting, I mean, this is just a DeerSafe action, right? But no, certainly, if anyone wanted to write a letter to the CRD, their addresses, their email addresses, are also on our website.
I feel so grateful for this opportunity to share some thoughts on alternatives to culling the deer. They're just such magnificent animals, and it's very meaningful to participate in a discussion on Face to Face. So thank you for watching the program.